Welcome to Streets of Fire, Episode 2, a six-part docu-series on why the Joe Douglas, Robert Saleh era did not work and where the New York Jets go from here. Episode 2 is going to be a roundtable episode with many familiar faces if you follow Badlands. Myself, Connor Rogers, Paul Kilgallen, Will Parkinson, Dan Essian, the rare five-person pod. It's like a Brady Bunch episode on Riverside right now. And what we're going to do with this episode is we're going to set the table for where the Jets were before the 2022 season started. We're going to work through game by game what that year was like, what it was like covering it, what it was like as a fan, what went wrong, notebook dump any leftovers we have from that season, and then put a bow on where things ended up before setting up episode 3, which is going to be a much closer look at the Aaron Rodgers years. So this is your 2022 Redux, a year that I think in retrospect felt like when the playoff drought was going to end for a large portion of it. And unfortunately, it did not break that way, and we'll dive into why. Before we start working through game to game, I'm going to start with you, Paul and Connor. Paul, I want you to talk through some of the offseason moves the Jets made and didn't make before this season started, coming off their 2021 season, which was Zach Wilson's rookie year, Robert Saleh's debut year as a head coach, and a season that, outside of the Mike White game, did not have much to cheer about. The Jets were bad. Their season was over, well in advance of Thanksgiving, like many other Jet seasons. But this was a season where it's year 2 for everybody, and there were higher expectations. So what were a few things that happened and didn't happen in the offseason before we started up?
Yeah, so I put together a few notes on Joe Douglas as part of this docuseries thing, and I wanted to look at kind of some of the draft misses. The draft misses are pretty well publicized, but we've always kind of had this phrase of Joe Douglas has his price, right? And I wanted to go back and look at it and see, like, over time, over the 6 years, was that really true? And it's funny, like, he kind of alternated between having his price and choosing to miss out on the top of the market over very small amounts of money, annoying amounts of money when you look back at it. But then in some years, he just attacked the top of the market and he just completely whiffed. Like, the top of the market was just bad in the years that he chose to participate in it. 2022 was one of the years where he kind of did a little bit of both. And so the first one, the top of the market, or the top of the class that year, was Laken Tomlinson. And if everybody remembers, we all wanted Brandon Sheriff, and he ended up going to Jacksonville. And I think there was a $3 million AAV jump in that contract, right? And so Sheriff has been fine in Jacksonville. Tomlinson was pretty much an abject disaster here for us. He's over in Seattle now. DJ Reed is really not one that it wouldn't be fair to complain about DJ Reed. He's done great here. Charvarius Ward was available, and there was a $2 million delta in that contract. But at the end of the day, it would be unfair to complain about DJ Reed. So I think you could call that a Joe Douglas win. Previous season, everybody was lamenting that we hadn't had a tight end pretty much in forever. And so he goes out and he gets the 2 richest tight end contracts that were offered in that offseason between CJ Uzomah and Tyler Conklin. I think you could say that Conklin has mostly worked out for the Jets. He's been a warrior, and he's never said the wrong thing, and he's been given many opportunities to say the wrong thing in the last 3 years. Uzomah was an abject disaster. I mean, there was more off the field Broadway stuff than there was any success on the field. And so I think when you look at those 2 as a package, it's probably a failure, but he did go top of the market. He just missed. He completely whiffed on it. The next one is going to hurt everybody a lot to hear. That was the Dwayne Brown and letting Morgan Moses walk to save about $5 million in AAV for that season. That one is one that everybody's going to remember because eventually we had to give up trade capital to bring Morgan Moses back, and Dwayne Brown was mostly a failure, and some would say responsible for the Aaron Rodgers Achilles injury. The next one is also a bad one. It's Jordan Whitehead, when Marcus Williams and the Honey Badger were both out there and available. He saved $7 million instead of Marcus Williams, and he saved only $2 million instead of Tyrann Mathieu. Saul Thomas was another one where you let Foley Fatukasi walk to Jacksonville, and you brought in a solid guy who I think had spent a year in Vegas with the Raiders because he had been pretty bad and had gotten released from the Niners. And then the final one is Quan Alexander, where you had two opportunities to bring in Kyle Van Noy, the 21 offseason when you brought in Jared Davis instead. And then the 22 offseason, Kyle Van Noy was available again. And you chose Quan Alexander to save $750,000 in AAV. And so I think 2022 is a pretty good encapsulation in terms of, Joe Douglas's offseason follies, where he just brought in the wrong player at the top of the market, or he saved a very stupid amount of money to bring in a much, much lesser player. So it's a really good offseason example to look at, honestly.
Chills down my spine at hearing Jared Davis's name again. And Marcus Williams was like the most quintessential almost Jet of almost Jets, like constantly rumored to the team. They were at the 1 yard line. The deal was almost done. And, the Joe Douglas has his price. He won't overpay because he was raised the right way by the Ravens and the Eagles while the Ravens outbid the Jets to get him. It's something that happened a few times, I think, against the Ravens and Eagles. And Whitehead and then eventually Chuck Clark, neither of which worked out in filling the safety void. Now, to pivot to quarterback, and I'm going to throw this to you, Connor. I think a lot of people forget that in the preseason of this year, Zach Wilson was trying to be Michael Vick and scramble around and hurt his leg. Everyone assumed that he had tore his ACL or Achilles and was out for the year. I remember Twitter doctors fighting about it. The Jets were prepared to go get Jimmy G at the last second. It was done like he was going to be out for the season. Turns out that's not the case. We get sort of an indefinite amount of time that Zach Wilson's going to be out, but it's understood that he's going to miss at least a few games. So Joe Flacco started this season for the Jets and started the first 3 games of the year for the Jets. But talk about sort of where Wilson was at, CR, going into this season and his splits ultimately compared to the other guys who were playing quarterback for the Jets in the early portion of this era.
Right. Well, there was, problem number one, I think, was that at the time, and it's funny to look back at it this way, but Flacco was not a high-end backup coming into this year. He was kind of holding on for dear life for his career. And I think the narrative around Flacco looks a little different now because he won comeback player of the year for 5 great games with the Browns. And he even said himself, like, what did I come back from the couch? I thought there was, other worthy candidates of that award. He had a great run with Cleveland, and then they got absolutely demolished in the playoffs because reality kind of settled in. So and Flacco's not a guy that's known as this amazing veteran presence for young quarterbacks wherever he goes. There's even been chatter about that with the Colts and Anthony Richardson right now. So that was always an odd choice to many people. You were coming into a year where, yeah, you needed to see what you had in Zach Wilson, of course, in year number 2. But number 1, Zach Wilson got hurt really early in the summer, and you knew what you were going into the season with. And it, to be honest, Flacco kind of struggled, 2 out of those 3 games. They didn't really compete against the Ravens week 1. They had the truly miraculous comeback against the Browns, which was partially more moronic by the Browns than, brilliance by the Jets. But the Jets did come back in that game. And then they lost against the Bengals in a game that wasn't very competitive on either side of the ball. Then Zach Wilson comes back against the Steelers. And so that was problem number 1. But then when you look at the larger scale picture, breaking it down, because there's a Mike LaFleur conversation to have here, because obviously Mike LaFleur was the fall guy at the end of the season, and that wasn't the decision of the coaching staff or the general manager, which is a larger problem. That was a all the way up top decision, interfering with the football operations. I mean, Flacco and Mike White made 8 starts that year, right? Their average pass yards per game, 280. Okay. Their touchdown to interception ratio, 8 touchdowns, 7 picks. Not great, but this was a team that had a really good defense, so you can live with that. And they obviously could run the ball at times that year. They took 19 sacks. Zach Wilson in one more start, right? 9 starts that year. He took 23 sacks. His touchdown to interception ratio was 6 touchdowns to 7 picks. So it kind of shows you the lack of volume in the pass game because they didn't trust him. And he was averaging 188 pass yards per game, which is uncompetitive at this stage of the modern NFL. So, and when you think back to it that year, I had gone through, the Jets ran 4 trick plays at the goal line because they were babying Zach Wilson. They had to find creative ways to kind of help him in the red, which is fine for a young quarterback. It's, I think, something that we wish the staffs did with Sam Darnold here, because Darnold's brain kind of melted in the red zone as a young player too. Between the 20s, he showed a lot of promise. He had a lot of red zone problems and goal line problems. And LaFleur was doing everything he could to get points on the board. You think of the trick play pass to Zach Wilson against the Steelers. They ran some wildcat against Green Bay and Miami with Breece Hall. They were trying everything they could. So they had to punch so far above their weight at times because of their, they were handcuffed at the quarterback position. And then you saw when Mike White came in, they obviously demolished the Bears. We say it on the pod as a running joke, but it's not really a joke. If Braxton Berrios catches that ball, they beat the Vikings that year. And then obviously Mike White gets sawed in half against the Bills. So, and they lose what, 6 games in a row to end the season. They're 7-4. They finish 7-10. And somehow the fall guy in all of this is the play caller, because I think the play caller was holding the young quarterback accountable and was probably the loudest guy in the room to go, because let's be real, the offensive coordinator isn't drafting the quarterback, right? So I think after 2 years, LaFleur had seen what he needed to see, felt like the team had a huge anchor dragging them down in Zach Wilson, was clearly very public about it, or even when he wasn't totally public about it, he was loud enough about it at One Jets Drive. And sometimes people don't want to hear that on an investment. And clearly Woody Johnson did not want to hear that with an investment. And, that's also a Joe Douglas situation where Joe Douglas took Zach Wilson number 2 overall. They traded Sam Darnold, and now he needs somebody that will build up Zach Wilson and to show the owner, I made the right decision. So, I'm not saying they let a genius walk out the building in LaFleur, but you could say they let out a competent young offensive coach walk out the door in LaFleur. I mean, the Rams gladly took him on right away and extended him shortly after he was there. So, and then you also need to look at the market. I mean, it's laughable that the Jets hired Nathaniel Hackett as the replacement, and whether they were lying or not, it's a bad look, right? You either hired Hackett because you were so desperate to get Aaron Rodgers, or what they said is they hired Hackett even if they weren't going to get Aaron Rodgers. That's what they were telling everyone, which is more concerning. So the fallout effect of all of this kind of let a larger issue linger that was glaring. And I'm not one to say give up on a young quarterback after 2 years, but they needed a real solution for year 3 if the bottom fell out, after the Zach Wilson debacle, and LaFleur, because he was vocal about it, really took the fall.
So I'm going to refocus us now over to the defensive side of the football and take us back to the beginning of the season. So 2021, the Jets defense was awful. I always think of the Eagles game where the Eagles just ran the ball like 100 times down their throat and just were laughing at the Jets as they were bullying them up and down the field. I think in the late season Saints game was very similar to that. The first 3 games of 2022 felt like more of the same, right? The Ravens had their way against the Jets defense. They had the miracle comeback against Cleveland, but Cleveland moved the ball well in that game. They were pretty uncompetitive in that Bengals game at home in week 3. And during that game, Jeff Ulbrich and Quinnen Williams and a couple other people, I think, had a blow up on the sideline. And I think the context of it around it was that the defensive line was effectively saying, stop blitzing so much, like let us get home, because they were getting killed and Jordan White was missing tackles and leading to huge gains and touchdowns. That's what sticks out. I was actually at that game in week 3. So I'm going to push this to you, Dan. The Jets start the season 1-2 after they lose to Cincy. From that point on, their defense is maybe the best defense in football the rest of the year, one of the best defenses in football. What changed, and how did this defense grow up and really allow the Jets to all of a sudden go from 1-2 to 7-4 and become competitive to be a potential playoff team?
Yeah, I think they just found their identity. I think there was a lot of, going back and forth. You mentioned the Quinnen Williams blow up and everything like that. There's just a lot of uncertainty about okay, what exactly are we trying to build here? What exactly, are our strengths and our weaknesses? And I think they kind of figured that out during that time period. And they really leaned on that secondary. That was a special season for that secondary. And I think it it almost promoted some of the wrong ideas for the front office and the coaching staff of like, oh, maybe we really just need Sauce and DJ Reed, and the safety position is kind of fine, and maybe we don't really need to invest anymore in that. But like the play that they got from that secondary for basically the entire season was unbelievable. And then of course the pass rush was pretty good. I think at